The photograph arrived at the Smithsonian Institution on March 14, 1923, sealed inside a leather portfolio that smelled of mildew and decades of silence. It was submitted by a lawyer from Harlan County, Kentucky, representing the estate of a woman named Ida Mae Thornton, who had died 3 weeks earlier at the age of 87. The accompanying letter was brief, almost dismissive. Per the deceased's final instructions, this image is to be preserved as historical record. No further explanation was provided. The photograph itself measured 8 by 10 inches, mounted on rigid cardboard that had yellowed with age. It depicted a family of 5 standing before a wooden farmhouse somewhere in the Appalachian highlands. The date inscribed on the back, in faded ink, read, September 1891, Blackburn Hollow. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, a standard frontier portrait of the kind produced by itinerant photographers who traveled the mountain valleys with their bulky cameras and chemical baths. But when the archive assistant held it beneath the lamp to catalog the details, she noticed something that made her breath catch. Behind the young girl on the left, a child no older than 9, dressed in a simple cotton dress, there was another figure. Not standing beside her, not part of the family arrangement, but present nonetheless, a pale shape, indistinct yet unmistakably human, hovering just beyond the girl's left shoulder. The assistant turned the photograph toward her supervisor without a word. He studied it for nearly a minute before speaking. "Could be a double exposure," he said finally. "Could be," the assistant replied, "but look at the shadow." The figure had no shadow, and its eyes, if they were eyes, were open. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because once you see what was really standing behind that little girl, you'll understand why some photographs should never have been taken. The Appalachian Mountains in the late 19th century were not merely isolated, they were temporally displaced, a region where the passage of years felt slower, heavier, as though the weight of the ridges themselves pressed down on calendars and clocks. Towns were separated not by miles, but by the difficulty of the terrain. A neighboring valley might as well have been a foreign country. Roads were few, and those that existed turned to impassable mud with every rain. Mail arrived irregularly. Law enforcement was a concept more than a presence. In this landscape, communities developed their own systems of justice, medicine, and belief. Feuds lasted generations. Healers were revered. And the dead, according to those who lived there, did not always leave when they were supposed to. Blackburn Hollow was one of the most remote settlements in Harlan County, a cluster of 7 families living in timber frame cabins along a creek that ran cold even in August. The soil was poor, but the forests were thick with game, and the people survived through a combination of subsistence farming, trapping, and an unspoken adherence to traditions older than the state itself. Among those families were the Thorntons. Ezra, a taciturn man in his 40s who worked a hillside plot of corn and tobacco. His wife, Nora, who had borne 6 children and buried 2, and their surviving 4, 3 boys and 1 girl. The girl's name was Ida Mae. She was 9 years old in the autumn of 1891, small for her age, with dark hair that her mother braided tightly each morning and eyes that seemed, according to neighbors, older than they should have been. She was quiet, obedient, and, by all surviving accounts, unremarkable. Until the day the photographer came. His name was Martin Calhoun, and he arrived in Blackburn Hollow on the 2nd week of September, traveling on foot with a mule that carried his equipment, a large format camera, glass plates, a portable darkroom tent, and bottles of silver nitrate solution wrapped in cloth to prevent breakage. He had been making his way through the mountain communities for 3 years, offering families the chance to preserve their likenesses for a modest fee, $2 per image, payable in cash or trade. Calhoun was a man of 35, rail-thin, with the hollow-cheeked look of someone who had seen hardship but learned to endure it without complaint. He spoke little, worked efficiently, and never stayed in one place longer than necessary. Those who hired him remembered his professionalism, his precision, and the unsettling stillness of his gaze. He set up his camera in front of the Thornton cabin on a clear Saturday morning. The light was good, soft and even, filtered through a thin veil of clouds. Ezra had agreed to the session reluctantly, persuaded by Nora, who believed the children should have something to remember their family by. should the worst come to pass. Illness, accident, or simple bad fortune could take any of them at any time. A photograph was insurance against oblivion. The family arranged themselves as Calhoun directed. Ezra and Nora in the center, the three boys standing to the right in descending order of height, and Ida May alone on the left, her hands folded in front of her apron. "Hold still," Calhoun instructed. "Do not move. Do not blink. Breathe lightly." The exposure required 30 seconds of absolute stillness. Any movement would blur the image, rendering it useless. Ida May did not move, but later, much later, when the photograph was finally examined under magnification, analysts would note that the girl's pupils were dilated far beyond what the available light should have caused, as though she were staring not at the camera, but at something behind it. Something that terrified her too much to scream. Calhoun developed the plate that evening in his tent, lit by a single kerosene lantern. The process was meticulous: coating, exposure, fixing, washing. He worked in silence, his hands moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who had performed the ritual hundreds of times. When the image emerged in the developing tray, he studied it carefully, checking for defects: scratches, bubbles, uneven exposure. There were none. The photograph was flawless, except for one detail. Behind the girl, visible only in the faint gradient between shadow and light, was a shape. A figure. Indistinct, translucent, but undeniably there. Calhoun stared at it for a long time. Then he rinsed the plate, dried it, and wrapped it in cloth without comment. The next morning, he delivered the photograph to the Thorntons, collected his payment, and left Blackburn Hollow without explanation. He never returned. And for 32 years, the photograph remained in the Thornton home, stored in a drawer, unframed, unspoken of, until the day Ida May Thornton, now an old woman living alone in a house that no longer existed on any map, wrote her final instructions and sent it to the Capitol. The Smithsonian initially classified the photograph as a curiosity, a possible artifact of early photographic anomaly, interesting but not urgent. It was filed in the archives under Regional Portraiture, Kentucky, 1880-1900, and largely forgotten. But in 1931, 8 years after its arrival, a researcher named Dr. Harold Fremont encountered the image while compiling a study on frontier life in Appalachia. Fremont was a cultural anthropologist, methodical and skeptical, trained to interpret material evidence without resorting to superstition. Yet when he examined the photograph under magnification, he found himself unable to dismiss what he saw. The figure behind Ida May was not a smudge, not a flaw in the emulsion, and not a double exposure. It had structure: shoulders, a head, the vague outline of arms. And most disturbingly, it had position. It was standing precisely where no one had been during the exposure. Fremont wrote to the Kentucky Historical Society, requesting any available records related to the Thornton family or Blackburn Hollow. The response came 6 weeks later, a single envelope containing 3 documents. The first was a land deed, dated 1889, transferring ownership of a 40-acre plot to Ezra Thornton. The second was a birth certificate for Ida May Thornton, born April 12, 1882. The third was a coroner's report. It was dated September 19, 1891, 6 days after the photograph was taken. The report was handwritten, filed by a traveling physician named Dr. Amos Fielding, who had been summoned to Blackburn Hollow to examine a body. The deceased was identified as Ida May Thornton, age 9. Cause of death undetermined. The notes were terse, clinical, and unsettling. Child found unresponsive in bed at dawn. No visible trauma, no fever, skin cold to touch, eyes open, pupils fixed and dilated. Family reports no illness in preceding days. Father states child went to sleep as normal following evening meal. Mother states child did not wake when called. No signs of struggle or distress. Body removed for examination. Burial conducted same day per family request. Fremont read the report 3 times. Then he returned to the photograph. If Ida May Thornton had died on September 19, 1891, then the photograph had been taken less than a week before her death. and the figure standing behind her, translucent, formless, waiting, had been there the entire time. Fremont contacted the lawyer who had submitted the photograph to the Smithsonian, hoping to locate surviving relatives or additional records. The lawyer replied that Ida Mae Thornton had been the last of her line. Her brothers had all died before the age of 40, 2 in mining accidents, 1 of pneumonia. Her parents had perished in a house fire in 1903. Ida Mae herself had never married, never left Harlan County, and had lived alone in a cabin near the ruins of Blackburn Hollow until her death. The lawyer included one final detail. In her will, Ida Mae had left a single instruction regarding the photograph. "Do not destroy it. Let them see what I saw." Fremont expanded his investigation. He traveled to Harlan County in the summer of 1932, accompanied by a photographer and a stenographer. His goal was to locate anyone who remembered the Thorntons, Blackburn Hollow, or the events of September 1891. What he found was silence. Most of the original families had long since moved away or died out. The few elderly residents who remained were reluctant to speak about Blackburn Hollow. When pressed, they offered only fragments, vague references to the girl who didn't wake up, the house that burned for no reason, and the photographer who never came back. One woman, a former neighbor named Cora Bledsoe, agreed to speak on the condition that her name not be published. She had been 12 years old in 1891 and remembered the Thorntons well. "That girl," she said quietly, "wasn't right after the picture was made." Fremont asked her to explain. She stopped talking, wouldn't eat, just stared at the wall. Her mama thought she was sick, but there was no fever, no cough. She just faded, like something had already taken her, and her body was just catching up. Fremont asked if anyone else had seen the figure in the photograph. Cora Bledsoe looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "We didn't need to see it," she said. "We all knew it was there." Fremont's research uncovered one additional piece of evidence. A journal entry written by Martin Calhoun, the photographer, discovered among his effects after his death in 1907. The entry was dated September 13, 1891, the day he took the Thornton photograph. It read, "Developed the Thornton plate this evening. Image is clear. Family positioned as instructed. Exposure time accurate. But there is something in the frame that was not there when I released the shutter." I have seen this before, twice in other places with other families. Each time the figure appears behind a child. Each time the child does not survive the month. I do not know what this means. I do not know if I am capturing something that exists or creating something that should not. I will not photograph children again. Calhoun kept his word. According to records, he transitioned exclusively to landscape photography after 1891. He never explained why, and he never spoke publicly about what he saw in the darkroom. By 1934, Fremont had compiled enough material to publish a preliminary paper titled Anomalous Imagery in Early Appalachian Portraiture. The paper included a reproduction of the Thornton photograph, along with Calhoun's journal entry, the coroner's report, and testimony from Cora Bledsoe. The response was immediate and polarized. Skeptics dismissed the figure as a chemical artifact, a trick of light, or deliberate fraud. Believers claimed it was evidence of spiritual presence, proof that death could be perceived before it occurred, that certain individuals possessed a sensitivity to forces beyond rational explanation. Fremont himself remained cautious. He did not claim the photograph depicted a ghost. He claimed only that it depicted something unexplained, something that warranted further study. But as he continued his research, a troubling pattern emerged. Calhoun's journal mentioned 2 other photographs. Fremont began searching for them. The first surfaced in a private collection in Tennessee, a portrait of a family from Carter County, taken in 1889. Behind a boy of 7 standing near the edge of the frame was the same indistinct figure, pale, translucent, positioned just beyond the child's shoulder. The boy had died 9 days after the photograph was taken. Cause of death: drowning. His body was found in a creek less than 50 yards from his home. The second photograph was located in a church archive in Virginia. a group portrait from 1887 showing a congregation gathered outside a chapel. In the back row, behind a girl of 11, was the figure. Faint, barely visible, but unmistakable once pointed out. The girl had died 12 days later. Cause of death? Undetermined. Her family reported that she had simply stopped waking up. 3 photographs. 3 children. 3 deaths. And in each case, the figure appeared in the same position, behind the child, slightly to the left, as though waiting. Now, I want you to do something. Go to the comments and write, "I see it too." Because what you're about to hear next will make you question whether some images are meant to be warnings or invitations. Fremont contacted photographic experts, chemists, and optical specialists, hoping to identify a scientific explanation for the recurring figure. The responses were varied but ultimately inconclusive. One chemist suggested that the figure could result from residual silver deposits on improperly cleaned glass plates, creating phantom shapes during development. But this theory failed to explain why the figure appeared in the same position across different plates, processed by the same photographer years apart. An optical physicist proposed that the figure might be a reflection, light bouncing off a surface behind the camera and imprinting onto the plate during the long exposure. But analysis of the photographs showed no corresponding light source, no reflective surface, and no environmental feature that could produce such a consistent effect. A folklore historian offered a different interpretation. The figure was not a photographic anomaly at all, but a manifestation of collective belief. In communities where death was ever present and explanations scarce, people projected their anxieties onto ambiguous images, transforming shadows into omens. Fremont found this explanation unsatisfying. It accounted for perception, but not for the undeniable fact that 3 children had died shortly after being photographed, and that in each case, the figure had appeared before the death occurred, not after. In 1936, Fremont received a letter from a woman in North Carolina. She identified herself as the granddaughter of Martin Calhoun and wrote that she had discovered additional materials in her late grandfather's belongings, letters, receipts, and one final journal kept separately from his professional records. She offered to send the journal to Fremont on one condition, that he never publish her grandfather's name in connection with the photographs. Fremont agreed. The journal arrived 3 weeks later. It covered the years 1885 to 1891 and contained detailed entries about Calhoun's work, his travels, and his growing unease with what he referred to as the shadow problem. One entry, dated August 1890, described an encounter in a town Calhoun did not name. A woman approached me after I completed a family portrait. She asked if I had seen anything unusual in the frame. I told her I had not. She insisted I look again. When I returned to the plate, I saw it. Faint, but present. A shape behind her youngest son. I told her it was a flaw in the glass. She did not believe me. She said her grandmother had been a seer and that certain people could sense when death was near. She said the boy would not live through winter. I dismissed her as superstitious. The boy died in November. Fever, they said. But I remember his face in the photograph. He looked as though he already knew. Another entry, dated March 1891, was more direct. I have come to believe that the camera does not lie. It shows what is there, whether we wish to see it or not. I have photographed 3 children now with the shadow present. All 3 have died. I do not know if I am documenting fate or if the act of capturing the image somehow seals it. Either way, I am complicit. I will not continue. The final entry was written on September 20th, 1891, the day after Ida Mae Thornton's death. I have burned my plates. I have dismantled my camera. I will not photograph another living soul. If there is judgment for what I have done, I accept it. But I will not be the instrument of revelation again. Calhoun never explained what he meant by instrument of revelation. But the journal made clear that he believed the camera had shown him something real, something that existed independent of belief, chemistry, or human error. And whatever it was, it had chosen children. Fremont's investigation reached a turning point in 1938 when he received an unexpected visitor, a physician from Johns Hopkins University named Dr. Ellen Voss. Voss specialized in pediatric neurology and had read Fremont's paper with professional interest. She did not believe in ghosts, but she believed in pattern recognition. Voss proposed a hypothesis. The figure in the photographs was not supernatural, but biological, a visual marker of an underlying physiological condition that preceded sudden death in children. She theorized that certain neurological or metabolic disorders might produce subtle changes in a child's appearance, pallor, altered posture, pupil dilation, that could be captured on film but not easily perceived by the human eye during a brief exposure. The figure, she argued, was not standing behind the children. It was an artifact of their own condition, a kind of optical echo created by the way light interacted with a body already in the process of failing. Fremont found the hypothesis intriguing, but incomplete. It explained the children's deaths, but not the figure's consistent position, not its human shape, and not the fact that it appeared behind them, rather than as part of them. Voss agreed to collaborate. Together they examined the 3 photographs under microscopic analysis, comparing the figure's density, edge definition, and tonal gradient to known photographic defects. Their findings were published in a joint paper in 1939. The figure, they concluded, was neither a chemical flaw nor a reflection. It possessed structural coherence, meaning it had been present in the physical space at the time of exposure, even if invisible to the naked eye. But what it was, they could not say. The paper ended with a question. If the camera records what exists, and this figure existed, then what are we to make of the fact that it appears only beside those who are about to die? The question remained unanswered until 1947, when a graduate student at the University of Kentucky named Thomas Millard stumbled upon a reference to Blackburn Hollow in an obscure collection of Appalachian oral histories. The reference came from an interview conducted in 1912 with an elderly woman named Silence Cobb, who had lived in the region her entire life. When asked about local beliefs regarding death, she described a tradition known as the fetch. According to Cobb, a fetch was a spirit that appeared to a person shortly before their death, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in reflections, and occasionally in photographs. It did not cause death, it announced it. Those who saw their fetch were said to be already claimed, their time measured in days rather than years. The fetch, Cobb explained, often appeared behind the person, standing just beyond their line of sight. It was not malicious. It was patient. When the fetch comes, she said, it means your thread's been cut. You just don't know it yet. Millard cross-referenced this description with Fremont's research and found the alignment undeniable. The figure in the photographs matched the traditional description of a fetch, indistinct, positioned behind the subject, appearing only to those marked for imminent death. But if the fetch was a spirit, then the question became, why was it visible only on film? Millard proposed an answer rooted in physics rather than folklore. He theorized that certain wavelengths of light, particularly those at the edge of human perception, could interact with photographic emulsion in ways that the human eye could not process in real time. If the fetch existed as a form of energy or presence operating slightly outside the visible spectrum, a camera's longer exposure time might capture it, while direct observation would not. This theory was speculative, untestable, and dismissed by most scientists. But it gained traction among a small group of researchers interested in the intersection of folklore, optics, and mortality. One of those researchers was a physicist named Dr. Raymond Keller, who had spent years studying anomalous photographic phenomena. In 1952, Keller published a paper arguing that consciousness itself might emit a faint electromagnetic signature at the moment of death, a kind of biological broadcast that could, under certain conditions, interact with light-sensitive materials. If Keller was correct, then the fetch was not a spirit in the supernatural sense. It was the visible manifestation of a death process already underway, a biological signal that the body was preparing to shut down, projected outward in a form that only the camera could see. Fremont, by then in his 70s, read Keller's paper with cautious interest. It offered a framework, rational, testable, for understanding what he had spent 2 decades investigating. But it did not explain why the fetch appeared as a figure, why it had a shape, why it stood behind the child as though waiting. And it did not explain what Ida Mae Thornton had seen in the days before she died. Something that made her stop speaking, stop eating, and stare at the wall until her heart simply stopped. In 1958, the Thornton photograph was loaned to a traveling exhibition on early American photography, displayed alongside other frontier images at the Museum of Natural History in New York. It was the first time the photograph had been shown publicly outside academic circles. Visitors filed past it without incident. Most barely noticed it. But on the third day of the exhibition, a woman stopped in front of the image and refused to move. Her name was Margaret Hale, a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania. She stood before the photograph for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the figure behind Ida Mae. When a museum attendant approached to ask if she was all right, Hale turned to her and said quietly, "I've seen this before." Hale explained that as a child, in 1923, her family had hired a traveling photographer to take a portrait at their home in rural Ohio. The photograph had been lost in a fire years later, but she remembered it clearly, because behind her younger sister, standing just beyond the frame's edge, there had been a figure. Pale, indistinct, waiting. Her sister had died 2 weeks later. Scarlet fever, the doctor said. But Hale had never forgotten the photograph, or the figure that no one else seemed to notice. The attendant took Hale's information and reported the encounter to the exhibition curator, who forwarded it to Fremont. Fremont, now retired, wrote to Hale and asked if she could recall any details about the photographer. She could not. But she remembered the date, June 1923. Fremont cross-referenced the date with known photographers active in Ohio during that period. He found 12. 9 had verifiable records. 3 did not. One of those 3 was a man named Samuel Lorne, who had worked briefly in the Midwest before disappearing from public record in 1924. Fremont could not confirm whether Lorne had any connection to Martin Calhoun, but the pattern was unmistakable. Certain photographers working in certain regions during certain periods had encountered the same phenomenon. And the children they photographed did not survive. By the 1960s, the Thornton photograph had become a minor legend within academic and paranormal communities. It was referenced in books on photographic anomalies, folklore studies, and unexplained phenomena. Reproductions circulated in magazines, often accompanied by sensationalized captions, "The ghost that knows your death," or "The camera that sees the reaper." Fremont despised the sensationalism. In his final published statement, written in 1963, he emphasized that the photograph was not evidence of the supernatural, but of something far more profound, the limits of human perception. "We assume," he wrote, "that what we see is all that exists, but the camera does not make that assumption. It records light, all light indiscriminately. And sometimes what it records reveals a reality we are not equipped to perceive. Whether that reality is spiritual, biological, or something else entirely, I cannot say. But I believe it is real." Fremont died in 1965 at the age of 79. His archives, including all his research on the Thornton photograph, were donated to the Library of Congress. The photograph itself remained in the Smithsonian, filed under Unexplained Phenomena, 19th Century American Photography. And there it rests today, faded, fragile, but undeniably present. A family stands before a wooden cabin. A mother, a father, 3 boys, and 1 girl. And behind the girl, barely visible in the gradient between shadow and light, something waits. In 1981, a journalist named Claire Arden visited the Smithsonian to research an article on historical photography. She requested access to the Thornton photograph and spent 2 hours examining it under magnification. When she returned the photograph to the archivist, she asked a question that had been asked many times before. "Has anyone ever tried to identify the figure?" The archivist explained that numerous attempts had been made, optical analysis, chemical testing, digital enhancement, but all had reached the same conclusion. The figure was present in the original plate, not added later, and possessed structural coherence. But its identity, if it had one, remained unknown. Arden asked if anyone had ever compared the figure to Ida Mae Thornton's appearance. The archivist paused. No one had. There were no other photographs of Ida Mae. The Thornton portrait was the only image of her that survived. But Arden noticed something that others had missed: the figure's posture. It was not standing upright, it was leaning forward slightly, as though trying to reach the girl, as though trying to touch her. Arden returned to the archives 6 months later with a forensic imaging specialist. Together, they created a high-resolution scan of the photograph and applied contrast enhancement to isolate the figure. What they found was disturbing. The figure's outline, when magnified, revealed faint but discernible features: the curve of a shoulder, the suggestion of a hand, and, most disturbingly, the vague impression of a face. A face that, according to the imaging specialist, bore a striking resemblance to Ida May herself. Not as she appeared in the photograph, but as she might have appeared if she had aged, if she had lived. The imaging study was never published. The specialist refused to attach his name to it, citing professional concerns. Arden's article, when it appeared in 1982, made no mention of the face. But the scans survived. And in 2003, they were reviewed by a team of researchers at MIT who were developing software to analyze historical photographs for signs of tampering or manipulation. The software confirmed what Arden's specialist had found. The figure possessed facial symmetry, anatomical proportion, and tonal consistency with a human face. But the resolution was too low to confirm identity. The lead researcher, Dr. A. Nathan Cross, offered a tentative hypothesis. The figure might be a photographic echo, a residual image created by the child's own reflection in a window, mirror, or polished surface behind the camera. If Ida May had been standing near such a surface during the exposure, her reflection could have imprinted onto the plate, creating the appearance of a second figure. But this theory failed to explain why the figure appeared older, why it had no shadow, and why, in every other photograph where the fetch appeared, the child died within days. Cross concluded his report with a single sentence: "Some images resist explanation, not because the technology is inadequate, but because the event captured exceeds the framework of rational analysis." In 2019, the Thornton photograph was digitized and added to the Smithsonian's online archives. Within hours, it went viral. Thousands of viewers claimed to see the figure. Some reported feeling uneasy after looking at it. Others described a sensation of being watched. A few claimed they had experienced vivid dreams about the photograph, dreams in which the figure stepped forward, moved closer, and whispered something they could not remember upon waking. The Smithsonian disabled comments on the image after reports of harassment and conspiracy theories, but the photograph remained online, available, waiting. Today, the original plate is stored in a climate-controlled vault, accessible only to researchers with written authorization. It is examined, on average, once every 3 years. The last person to request access was a graduate student from Appalachian State University, writing a thesis on death rituals in rural America. She spent 40 minutes with the photograph, taking notes, comparing it to historical records. When she left, the archivist asked if she had found what she was looking for. She hesitated before answering. "I found something," she said. "I'm just not sure what it means." She did not elaborate. But in her notes, submitted with her thesis 6 months later, there was a single underlined sentence: "The figure is not behind the girl. It's waiting for her to turn around." The Thornton photograph remains one of the most studied and least understood images in American photographic history. It has been analyzed by scientists, folklorists, historians, and skeptics. None have provided a definitive explanation. Some believe it is evidence of a spiritual presence, a fetch, a harbinger, a manifestation of death itself, made visible through the unique chemistry of early photography. Others believe it is a biological phenomenon, an electromagnetic signature of cellular collapse, captured by a medium sensitive enough to record what the human eye cannot perceive. Still others believe it is nothing more than a coincidence, a flaw in the plate, a trick of light, and a tragic series of events that created a pattern where none existed. But none of these explanations account for the children. For the 9-day-old boy who drowned, for the 11-year-old girl who stopped waking up, for Ida May Thornton, who stared at the wall until her heart stopped beating. None of them explain why, in every photograph where the figure appears, the child is already gone, even if they don't know it yet. If you've watched this far, it's because you understand that some stories don't end. They wait. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far, so I can get to know you and see who really values the histories we uncover here." If this story stayed with you, if it made you look twice at old photographs or wonder what the camera sees that we don't, then leave a like and share this video. Because there are more images like this. More figures standing just beyond the frame. More children who never had the chance to grow old, and someone needs to remember them. Subscribe if you believe that history, no matter how dark, how strange, or how unexplained, deserves to be told, because the past doesn't disappear. It only waits for someone willing to look, and when you look closely enough, sometimes it looks back.